Slow down in every way. And it's something that's hard. Slow down when you're walking your dog to appreciate nature and others the way your dog does or a child does. Slow down to listen to others. Time is precious and time is fleeting, but slow down.
All right, Dr. Neil Grunberg. It's been so long since we've caught up, and a lot has changed in your life. This is a very different topic than our first conversation, but how are you? It's so good to see you.
Oh, thank you. It's good to see you too, Boomer, and to hear your voice. I'm quite well. Clearly, a lot's changed in the world and in many ways over the last few years. So, for those listeners, I hope people are at peace and at well or recovering from the various challenges we each face. But I've been well since I met you. I became a grandfather for the first time.
Oh,
Uh,
congratulations. That's amazing.
yeah. So, but most importantly, my mother turned 100 years old and is healthy. My first grandchild was born. My wife and my first grandchild, and my four kids are grown and doing well. So we've been really fortunate and blessed with good health. Thank you. I hope you're
Wow.
well also.
Wow, you'll maybe get recruited for an upcoming Blue Zones documentary for your mother. So that's incredible. Well, congratulations on all the success, especially during these challenging times. Uh, but I want to start things off, Dr. Grimberg, with just frankly a question, because you and I came to know each other through your study and research of drug addiction, and in particular nicotine. And today we're going to be talking about leadership, in particular, leadership and followership within healthcare systems. There seems to be, a slight difference in topic there. And I know you've spent the past 8 years studying this subject matter, but if you don't mind, just take us through what prompted the pivot, if you will. Was it sort of a pull factor, a push factor, or just general interest?
Well, thank you for the question. I know on the face of it, it looks like from the study of nicotine, nicotine addiction, drug addiction to the study of leadership, followership, teamwork seems wildly different, but there is a foundational similarity. And that is the way I was raised. I was raised by my parents with a focus on doing work as a scholar, as a educator, as a practitioner to try to help improve the human condition and to look around at the world, at least through the lens in which I see it, and what are the most important, cogent, and robust questions. So, what's relevant here is uh, I was I grew up in the 1960s. I was born in 1953. The reason I bring that up is what was so salient at the time was music, growing rock and roll, other music. I'm a musician. I'm a drummer by from a long time ago, and I bring that up because so many of the issues that seemed exciting but then became challenging was why did so many friends? Because I was a bit of a precocious musician, I played with people who were 5, 10 years older than me. Fortunately, I was young enough that I didn't get into experimenting with drugs, but I saw it everywhere around me. I watched fellow musicians being amazed at their mind expansion and their creativity expansion, only to watch too many friends destroy themselves on drugs. Why? We didn't know how these drugs affected the mind and why people couldn't stop. We did not know the neuroscience and the psychology of addiction. So that was a profound question that I thought maybe I could help improve the human condition. And I was fortunate to have teams of scientists in which we did that. We talked about that in your other podcast. And I'm one of the scientists who proudly helped discover the mechanisms by which nicotine and other drugs are addicting, so how to treat it and why. So we, in a sense, move forward. I'd say fast forward, but the last 50 years, 40, 50 years have gone faster than I'd hoped. But although my work then moved from drug addiction, stress and drugs, traumatic brain injury, post traumatic stress, over the last 10 years, new questions started emerging, particularly within healthcare where I work. And the questions of burnout, and difficulty. But most importantly, the change in which healthcare, medicine, nursing, psychology became, as we say, a team sport. No longer the individual authoritarian physician who came to your home, knew everything or nothing, but he, in most cases, 50 years ago, would make decisions. Instead, it's the they. Physicians with all sorts of specialties, nurses, psychologists, dentists, physical therapists, social workers, as well as the spiritual part of health, clergy people, and then the new partner, the patient and significant others themselves, because of this computer that we carry in most of our pockets or our iPhones, access to information. So, with that became a greater interest because I'm trained in psychology and pharmacology and neuroscience. Questions started coming to me more about the social psychology of the interactions. And then, as this just became clear, it also was the president of the university where I'm privileged to work, the Uniformed Services University, approached me about 8 or 9 years ago and said information had come out of the U.S. military health experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. The experience has many outstanding individuals, but difficulties, challenges, and it's sometimes failures of teamwork and communication. I was encouraged to look into this area. I got interested in it. Uh, my interest then grew, and I found this to be one of the most, probably the most challenging, and I like to believe the most important scholarship that I've been doing in my entire career.
There's a lot to go on there, obviously, and I want to kind of potentially do this chronologically, although I'm not sure how it's going to end up. And so, as you're being prompted these questions by the university, and seeing this sort of global shift and from that authoritarian individual to perhaps more team model. Uh, how did you learn this? Because there's an element of learning and scholarship, as you alluded to here, that comes into play. And my background happens to be in business, and yours in medicine, psychology, etc. Um, where did you turn when it came to, oh, I'm going to start learning this new field? And perhaps it wasn't so new to you because, as you alluded to, that human condition element was pretty persistent throughout. And I'm sure leadership came up before. But who did you turn to when you started at ground zero, or, maybe ground or floor one, so to speak?
Thank you, Boomer. That's a terrific question. Whenever I have a question posed to me, which in any field, I turn to people who are knowledgeable scholars and I dig deep into the literature. But particularly in this case, that there was a bit of an irony when asked to focus on leadership, because among the things, although I taught behavioral neuroscience, drug addiction, I also taught advanced social psychology, the behavior, the cognition, the motivation of groups. The university's president knew I had some knowledge and had touched upon leadership. But in fact, what happened was really a surprise that I had to my own. I was mentored. My PhD advisor was a famous psychologist named Stanley Schachter, who also worked closely with Leon Festinger. Both of those social psychologists were trained by the great Kurt Lewin. Now, I mentioned Kurt Lewin because Lewin was a mathematical psychologist in the early part of the 20th century who really attempted, through what he called field theory, is to describe the human interactions and conditions with mathematical algorithms and relationships. However, Lewin, like many of the psychologists in the early 20th century who turned their interest to social psychology, was Jewish and fled the Nazis and was overwhelmed and stunned by the Third Reich and the Nazi movement. The reason I mentioned this is Lewin in the late 30s turned his attention from mathematical psychology to the first research scholarly study of leadership. Lewin identified late 30s, early 40s, the three types of leaders: authoritarian, democratic, and laissez faire. He started this study. So, as part of my own education, I learned lots about Lewin's work. It was in the back of my mind. So, when decades later I'm asked to focus on leadership, I went back to Lewin's original work and then I followed it. What had happened? Most leadership scholars in the mid 20th century focused on political leaders. So we moved from a concern about Hitler to a focus on US presidents, and then work on political scientists. The work of James McGregor Burns, for example. Later, it became very clear that leadership was being taught and distinguished from management and business schools. But I started reading and reading literally everything I could find.
Mm.
There's a wonderful general textbook, still in its now in its ninth or later edition by Peter Nordhaus, which is a wonderful overview of leadership models. But I tried to literally dig into everything I could find. Then something else happened. It was it sounds corny, but it was almost karma. Just as I accepted the task from the university to figure out what forms or what approaches to leadership best suited the training of military medical leaders. And I was looking all over the internet. You could pay enormous amounts of money for 1 week at various famous universities and take a 1 week course in executive leadership. I
Mhm.
would call them, I look at them, and frankly, they knew less than I did. It was
Mm.
ridiculous. But literally, the week that I agreed to do this, I stumbled on something that had just been announced. The brainchild of the late US President George H.W. Bush, the 41st president,
Mm.
was so concerned about 9 years ago with the political separations between the two major parties in the US at the time. It was almost prophetic that President George H.W. Bush said we needed to bring together Democrats, Republicans, young and middle aged leaders with all different perspectives, focus, gender, age, religion, value systems to come together. And for the first time in US history, something new was created. It was called the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. It was George H.W. Bush, also with his son, George W. Bush, also with a Democrat, Bill Clinton, but also to balance it out, although he had deceased, the foundation and library of Lyndon Baines Johnson, two Democratic, two Republican presidents coming together and then finding what they said was the most promising 60 leaders in the US. I applied. There were more than 1,000 applicants. It was a very rigorous. I was incredibly fortunate to be selected to be in that inaugural class. We then spent 6 months, or we'd meet for 4 days every month with lots of homework in between to learn about everything we could. That was 8 years ago, and made a commitment to stay connected. So there's been a class of 50 or 60 presidential leader scholars since then. I've had the privilege to meet them, work with them, help mentor some. But this gave me a tremendous network. From then, I went to a different level because I realized, although we're proud in the US and believe we have a broad perspective, it's obviously not the breadth of a global perspective. So the next step for my learning was I reached out. I visited all sorts of leadership organizations until I found one that really impressed me, called the International Leadership Association, with members from approximately 110 nations, so much broader perspective. With some colleagues, we created a healthcare leadership community within it. And now I've had the privilege to learn now from leaders with perspectives around the world all different perspectives, economic, political, healthcare systems where I start, but values and perspectives and cultural norms. And I like to think that I just turned 70 years old. Fortunately, I'm in good health as far as I know.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I hope that I'm just beginning to have the broader global perspective to really make a meaningful contribution.
Again, when you speak, there's so many avenues I can go down here because there's on one hand the global perspective, there's the healthcare perspective, and there's that transition from authoritarian to team, and I want to get into. Uh, we'll come back to the authoritarian to team point in a little bit, but what I wanted to get into was as you take all of this information, which there are, as you alluded to, there's every university has a program on leadership. Maybe not every university, but a lot of them. And a lot of these top universities have programs on leadership, which may or may not be uh, great, so to speak. But what you've been able to do in taking in all of this information is to form it into a couple of models, and perhaps one started before the other and one evolved into the other. But one of the models that you mentioned in some of your other interviews, there's a 4C model, and then there's the leadership followership model. uh, can you talk about how those developed and maybe go into what they specifically are, and how they've sequenced from each other?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, when seeking out a conceptual framework or a model, the earliest writings that I can find, of which I'm aware, on leadership date back millennia to Homer's epic poems, and particularly in the Iliad. We see it some in the Odyssey. In Homer's description, we learn about what later became known years later by Thomas Carlyle, great man theory. I mention this only because the importance and the obvious relevance of leadership and whether it's effective or ineffective is profoundly clear in military and in warfare. So whether we go from the Trojan Wars, we move up to modern day. Modern day still, I'm going to go back a couple centuries. So next, because of that history, and because again I'm a faculty member at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in the United States, and my opinions I express here are my own, but I think deeply about serving the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the public health. I then studied what was the perspective on leadership from the various US military services. And here it's very interesting because they each have a different emphasis based on their different missions. Simply put, now I'm going to go back 50 to 100 years and pull it together to get to the models that we've created. The US Army used to use, and sometimes still use, the catchphrase be, know, do. Be a leader and know what to do and do it. So that emphasis, if you think about who you are and what you do, is really an emphasis on what has been called character, not only
Mm.
moral compass and integrity, who you are and knowing who you are, and then actions or competence or competencies. From the US Navy, however, there's a very different focus. And the focus is that the responsibility, the role, and the authority of the leader, the captain of the ship, changes at sea versus when in dock.
Mm.
And in fact, historically, because of lack of communication a century ago, the power, responsibility, authority of a ship captain is enormous. But the Navy really emphasizes, if you will, that context in which it happens. This, when we look at the Air Force, the US Air Force has a very different emphasis because it's a big emphasis on pilot and machine, but the pilot then has a focus on their training, their relationship either with a co pilot or with command towers, then their reliance on those individuals who support that remarkable, expensive, and complex machinery, and then the overall system, they talk about the person, the interpersonal relationships, the team that supports it, and the organization. And then the public health service, in which I've been proud to work with several US Surgeon Generals, focuses that they don't have machines, they don't have troops, they don't have this. Their warfare, if you will, is against disease and injury, and everything for them is communication.
Mm.
So from this study, one of my colleagues, Dr. Charles Callahan or Chuck Callahan, and I took out 4 C elements: character, who you are; competence, what you do; context, where and when do you do it; communication, how do you do it. Although communication is a competence appearing in all models, we thought it was so important we need to separate it out and expand it. Those were the 4 C elements, or 4 C, across 4 psychosocial levels: development of ourselves, personal; development of our relationship in dyadic relationships with one other person, with a colleague, with a friend, with a spouse, a subordinate, a boss, a patient, etc. Then the team, the T, a larger group working together for a common goal and mission. And then the organization, the system, the culture. Then, as I studied this more, my colleagues and I, especially my colleague Erin Barry, a colleague and another faculty member with whom I work closely, we started realizing that the team must understand relationships. So the leader must understand the followers must understand the leaders. And then the insight we had is, wait a minute, followership must be developed in ourselves and others. So we then broadened our model in recent years, changed the 4C PEDO model to a leadership followership, or the leader follower framework. The 4C elements across these 4 psychosocial levels, but then understanding something that we think is new in our conceptualization. The follower is not them, and the leader is not always me or us. Each of us, each of us has the yin yang of being a leader and a follower, meaning when are we directing or responsible, and when are we receiving or open. And this gets back to, we mentioned briefly, my early life and many, many years as a drummer and as a jazz drummer and as a member of various ensembles. I think of teams like a great jazz ensemble. There's a designated leader, likely, who chooses the music or writes the music, determines the sound. When the ensemble plays together, it's remarkable. But what's special about jazz is that each member of a jazz ensemble has unique contributions. In particular, for me as a drummer, even though I pride myself on setting the tempo, the rhythm, the style, of the music, I know when to play loud and to drive it and to solo. I know when to play in the middle and blend. I know when to play soft. And the most challenging and perhaps most mature understanding is I know when not to play at all and to let the guitarist, the trumpet player, the saxophonist, the bass player, the pianist take over. So that's what's evolved in our understanding of a model. We have to understand who we are, but in the character, if of who I am, there's an internal self awareness and external self awareness. Do I know my values, my perspectives, my biases? And do I understand externally how others perceive me? In character, in competence, pardon me, in competence, we know the role specific competence to be a drummer, to be a host of a podcast, to be an attorney, a plumber, a carpenter, an artist, a physician, a nurse, the different roles, a computer scientist. You have to have certain expertise in that role to lead that group. But then there are also what we refer to as the transcendent leadership and followership skills: decision making, problem solving, emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, motivating others. In context, we recognize, and now I go back to Kurt Lewin. Lewin argued for psychosocial context, in which it was physical, psychological, and social. My context, again from the Navy, am I at land or sea? But am I leading, and it's outside or inside? Does the weather matter? But there's also inside me physical context. Am I tired? Am I dehydrated? Am I energized? Am I healthy? Am I sick? Then there's the social and the cultural context of different cultures, particularly become apparent as I think more globally. And then there's the one factor that we all experience that affects our cognition, our thoughts, and our behaviors: stress. So, the context of stress. The last C, again, communication. Communication is fascinating, and we refer to it as the how of leadership of followership. But when I have asked so many learners, and I'm talking about all different levels, from grade school through high school to med school to professionals and business people, define communication. Many
Hmm.
people will laugh, say, what do you mean it's obvious? Okay, what do you think it is? Well, it's sending information, giving information. Well, actually, that's only part of it. Communication is sending and receiving verbally and non-verbally with the goal of reaching mutual understanding. We've also argued that when we study communication, the more responsibility, if you will, the more of a leader you need to be, the more difficult and important part of communication is not sending, but is receiving, receiving the input. And how to receive communication is hidden in the word listen. It's hidden, it's right there. If you take the letters LISTEN and rearrange them, they tell you how to listen. They spell two words. I'll just pause so listeners can think if they can find the two words.
Ooh, I think I know one of them at least, but I'll let you go for
Uh, well, we were demonstrating it.
Mhm.
One is the word silent, to be silent and to receive. And the other interesting word is the word enlist, because enlist means to bring people together, bring them in, create a psychologically safe space where they feel respected and encouraged to be enlisted or engaged. If a leader can enlist the followers, the group, and be silent to receive the information before determining what's the best path towards the mission or the goal, then we enhance understanding and we optimize the likelihood of success.
Dr. Grunberg, you have this ability to explode where I thought we were going in this conversation into almost a fractal that can go in many different directions. And so, first, I just want to thank you for presenting this model because what I've found, and I didn't realize this till recently, that you had developed the model of leadership followership, is that as a society in particular, particularly in the United States, and particularly in the area that I come from, business, there's this emphasis on leadership, and it's, or at least in recent years, has appeared as sort of the high testosterone, overly confident, uh, in often cases, male leader who gets put on a pedestal, if you will, and seen as that authoritarian that, in many ways, with your model in healthcare, we're not necessarily trying to avoid, but trying to move more towards that team model. And one of the things that I've always thought was missing is like, okay, that dynamic, that yin yang dynamic, whereby you trade off between leader and follower. So thank you for bringing this to this audience's attention, because it's quite a fantastic model. There are, of course, areas that I want to explode. If we want to explode, meaning dive a little bit deeper here, because if I want to go through each and every one of these, you and I are going to be talking for the next couple of days. But which I would love. I know you probably have other things to do, but I, of course, would love to pick your brain on that more and more. The A couple of elements that you mentioned in here, I want to get into how somebody might train them uh, before we get into communication. So, when it comes to decision making, problem solving, motivation, uh, how do you look at training that? Are these trainable? I would assume so. And is it, in the case of decision making, studying cognitive biases, or what would be sort of the methods by which one can train their ability, these kind of three abilities?
Yeah, yeah, that's again another very thoughtful question. Um, I'll say we, my colleagues and I, at Uniform Services, as well as other colleagues and educators now that we're focused on around the country, as well as various consultants who go into companies to help with, particularly with C-suite or developing corporate other leaders. But I'll say I believe that it needs to start with self-awareness. So there is a school of thought that says the most important um, ability or to really focus on develop first foundationally is emotional intelligence, which has four component parts. So this is the work of Daniel Goleman, of Boyatkis, and of others, originally of Peter Salovey and Mayer and others. The notion is, am I aware of my own emotional and motivational states? That is, what's behind or the cause of my thoughts and behavior. Am I aware of them? Then the next step, if I'm aware of them, do I am I able to control them appropriately? So I use the right motivation and emotion, whether it's of energy or relaxation, and whether I'm being gentle or strong, what's situationally appropriate. Then we move to the more challenging. Do I understand in another that I and you, Boomer, or you and your colleagues, or me and the team I'm working with, do I understand not just the behaviors and the abilities, but the values and the motivations, the emotions of others? And then the fourth step in developing emotional and social intelligence is, do I build stronger relationships from that? There's now actually more recently an argument that there's another step beyond from the control of self to the small group, and that's what's called cultural intelligence, which I think is important because that's both within a nation and, of course, among and between nations. So, with regard to building these strengths and these abilities, I certainly believe that individuals can and should learn these, but by first admitting and focusing on ourselves. Who are we? What do we believe? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Then from that, one needs to start looking at these different kinds of competencies. Again, following our 4C elements. Do I have the appropriate competencies relevant to the role I'm in? Am I a systems engineer? Am I running a radio station? Am I a gardener? Am I, we go on and on and on. What used to be called the mailroom approach. Do I have the humility and the self awareness that I really need, not necessarily to become the best at all these elements, but I must understand the skills and knowledge, or some people refer to the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, to do a certain job. So if I'm going to be the leader of a certain group, I certainly have to understand what goes into it, well enough that I'll be able to understand what I ask of and perhaps demand of my team, competence. Then, if you will, you can move to considering context. How is it affecting this? And then work hard on communication skills. Now, while you're asking about the learning, there's something else. Fortunate or unfortunate, we each have experienced strong, good leaders and poor leaders. And perhaps some people believe, and I tend to be in this camp, that we perhaps learn more from poor leaders than we do from good role models because there's so many poor leaders. So for here, we've also distinguished what constitutes a poor leader. So here, my colleague Aaron Barry and I developed a concept which we call BIT leadership. That there are three kinds of poor leaders categorically: bad, ineffective, or toxic. People use the word toxic too broadly. It means something specific. A bad leader is rather rare, but there are bad leaders who are evil, morally poor, outrageous. We know historic examples. I won't go through. But one can also be an unintentional bad leader because of mental illness, because of drug abuse, because of other upbringing, and behave in a way that's truly outrageous. Fortunately, that's a minority number of poor leaders. Most poor leaders are ineffective leaders. And the most common cause of ineffective leadership is absence, psychological absence, not connecting, not being there, or physical absence. You'll see why I'm bringing this up, because by being aware of these difficulties or these tendencies towards bit leadership, this is also important in developing our own leadership style, and we can avoid that. Toxic leaders are really interesting. Toxic is based on the word toxin, like poison.
Mm.
Certainly, the person who says nasty things, is rude, is outrageous, and it's just they think their jokes are funny or they're outrageous like that, is one type of toxic leader that either needs to be corrected or get away from. But the more interesting toxic leader that we all have a tendency to be, again, is not intentional. And that's the person who unintentionally plays favorites. I had a chairman, a boss once, fantastic guy, brilliant psychologist, brilliant chairman, I thought, in many ways. And he was fabulous for me and fabulous for one other member of the department. What I didn't realize is because he didn't separate his professional from his personal beliefs. So it got to the point that the three of us went out to lunch 3 to 5 days a week, and he found it easier to do all of our department's business there. Nicest guy in the world.
Mm.
Now you can imagine what happened to the other members of the department. They not only felt cut out, they were cut out. He actually was an unintentional, had aspects of being a toxic leader. I mentioned this because when you say the development self-awareness, how do I perceive myself, my values? Do others perceive me the way I intend or not? Do I have the competence, basic skills? Do I consider the context? Do I think about communicating clearly and listening? And do I avoid the bit leadership? The most difficult are the ones you asked for, though. Emotional intelligence grows from the self awareness, conflict resolution, decision making. That takes experience, that takes openness to feedback. One thing I always say with my learners, whether they're colleagues or students, is frank feedback is a gift because most people are too hesitant. I don't mean to be rude, and one should be very respectful. But frank via is, Boomer, this is what you do exceptionally well. This is what you do okay that could be better. This is all right, and here's where you should improve. And I, would offer it, and you to me. So I really believe that as we develop knowledge, there is our real goal, and I'm going to go back to Greek philosophy, is do we ever achieve wisdom,
Mm.
which is a different level? Something I've been working on for decades. Maybe I'm getting there, but all kidding aside, do I use my knowledge? Do I understand people? And do I know when to lead, when to follow the yin yang within myself? Or as the drummer, when to play loud, when to play quiet, let others go. But having trusting relationships, psychologically safe environments, the two greatest gifts we give and receive are the two T's: trust and time. And to really value and embrace trust and time with each other, I believe we can grow. I believe we can be more effective, whether it's in business, in medicine, in education, in families, in, and Lord knows, in international challenges to avoid conflict.
Mm. There's as I'm listening to you talk there, Dr. Grunberg, there's an element of context that, um, and alluding to your former department head, that sort of adds this element of compartmentalization almost. And in many ways, I would be curious, and perhaps this is a separate conversation, how much bleeding there is, for lack of a better word, from personal to professional. And I'm sure context will drive that amount of bleeding, but that ability to kind of integrate across all of your leadership and followership roles uh, seems quite valuable. But there is, I would assume that there's particular instances where context adds an element of needing to leave the personal belief at home, for instance. Uh,
That's Boomer. You've raised a really important challenge of self awareness, and I've certainly fallen into the trap myself and failed. Give a specific example. Oh, let's see now. It's about 25 years ago. My father passed away. My father was a very powerful, dynamic individual who I admired and respected, but we also had our own conflict because I am my father's son, and so I stood up to him, and we fought plenty as well.
mm,
We reconciled, fortunately, well before his death. His death hit me much, much harder than I expected. So, with my team, in which I had, oh, maybe 6 or 8 PhD students, 3 or 4 research assistants, I had maybe a group of 8 or 10 or 12 people were my tight team I worked with every day. Up until my father's death, I was always good at being clear that I was the professor, I was the leader, but who would also listen and share and respect them. But I wasn't their buddy. I
mm,
slept. A couple of them in particular um, w- uh, were really warm and could see I was in pain, and so would let me talk. But as I now let my guard down and became friends, unfortunately, I talked most with one of the more attractive young women who one of the guys in my group was interested in on a personal and sexual level. So when she's in my office chatting with me and then would come out and, after having a warm discussion with me and I felt better, I get back to work. Now he starts resenting me. He starts hitting her. She thinks she has a special relationship with me. Oh my God, I
mm,
completely messed up. It took me 2 to 3 years to repair the relationships of that team. So
mm,
it's very important to know our roles and our responsibility. And that was all based on misunderstanding and perspective.
mm,
So it's really important. Another place to go, all right, is depending on your listeners. Again, I'm a fortunate and proud father of 4 now grown kids, young adults. My father, although strong, the mistakes he made with me, and we get back to learning from bad leadership, is he never adjusted his relationship with me based on my age or my knowledge.
mm,
I was 25 or 30, he treated me like I was 10 or 15. In contrast, my late father-in-law made remarkable adjustments. So I learned something else in teaching leadership. I say, listen to this. You need to be an adaptive leader. We've already talked about what's called shared leadership, depending on the context. You also need to be an adaptive leader and need to be an innovative leader. So to me, those are the three most interesting: adaptive, innovative, and shared.
Hmm.
Adaptive uses the following uh, analogy. You're walking your 3-year-old child across a very busy street. How should you treat them? Well, you should be an authoritarian. You hold their hand tight. You may tell them about traffic, but you don't let go of that hand, and they go when you go, or they don't go when you don't go. You're crossing a similar busy street with your 13-year-old. Oh, you try to be authoritarian, you grab their hand while they have their earbuds in, they're talking, they're going to pull away, maybe they'll run into traffic. It's outrageous, but you let them make all decisions because they're not really focused. So you move more to a democratic or shared leadership. Hey, let's decide whether to cross the street. You watch them closely, but you don't. You're crossing the busy street with your 33-year-old. Like, authoritarian, that's ridiculous. Shared leader, democratic, hey, let's vote on when we're going to. You've moved to a laissez faire. So the situation, the personnel involved, your relationship, all of these need to be considered, I think, when making those changes in order both the teaching of it, your own self-awareness, as well as the respect of the group. The other thing we haven't talked about much is understanding followership types,
Mm.
because that's another very interesting wrinkle that we've just recently thrown into our model.
If it's okay with you, I'd actually like to go into those followership types because in uh, as far as I know, in the discussions of leadership, it's rare that we actually discuss followership and that element of yin and yang and when to alternate between leader and follower, at least in traditional corporate sense. I'm not even sure it's made it into that general awareness yet. But I do want to get into communication, and we'll do that after this. But let's talk about followership types because, at least in the context of previous discussions about leadership or leaders versus followers, there's almost this singular label of follower, and maybe people have heard different elements of leaders. Certainly we've discussed it here, but what is the sort of different characteristics or different models of followers?
Yeah, it is interesting that you're absolutely right. Business schools, military service academies, others for decades, if not centuries, focused on leader development, different arguments about are leaders born or made, or is it a mix? We've now really moved to leadership is about relationship building and effectiveness and influence, and all can become stronger. But the interest in followers or followership is a relatively new concept. To start with, the obvious point, but I will state it anyway: without followers, there is no leaders. You're a lone person. So clearly, you must have followers. And in fact, some have argued that it's the first and early followers that both make someone by definition a leader, as well as to reinforce or support their mission and vision. But followership itself is critically important and has really changed. When we have had times historically or within different units within society where the designated leader has tremendous resources, knowledge, skills, money, whatever, and the followers have nothing or education, there is such a disparity. The relationship is largely directive from the leader if they, the leader, can get the support and the support and alignment of the followers. However, as followers, resources, particularly knowledge, experience, etc., And now access to information, again, with this, the iPhone and the computers we have access to, the distance of resources between leader and follower has diminished dramatically. So again, clearly there's the parent with the 3-year old or 5 3-year olds crossing the street. The disparity in knowledge and experience is enormous. The individual with others who are challenged in various ways. The elderly, I mentioned my mother is 100 years old, and she admits there's certain things she can't physically do. How I have to help her or lead her now, and she's comfortable with that. But most relationships, particularly in the workplace or day-to-day affairs, they're not that the differences in abilities and resources between leader and follower has diminished greatly. So therefore, we need to understand our own followership type. With this, several different scholars have spoken to this, most notably Robert Kelly, separately Barbara Kellerman, and Ira Chaloff. Basically, we have studied these scholars who've only focused on followership over this century, really, over the last 20 or 30 years. And again, my colleague Aaron Barry and I have come up with our own conceptual model. We say we've taken largely from Kelly's work and Kellerman the idea that first we should consider there are 5 general types along a dimension of engagement or passion or involvement with a given activity. The person who does absolutely nothing, doesn't want to be engaged at all, it's called an isolate. They're separate from the group or the issue. The person, a little bit more common, who seems to be there but doesn't really contribute is called a bystander. The most common type of follower in terms of engagement is what is called a participant. They do things, they're involved, they do what they're told. Now we have a little bit more engaged person. It's called the activist. The activist is a participant who also offers new ideas, their own ways of doing it, maybe critiques. And then there's the extreme follower who's engaged with the mission. That person is called the diehard, literally, the do or die in favor or oppose. Now, that's largely the Kellerman and Kelly model. We've added another dimension, what's called an orthogonal dimension. We say that in addition to engagement, we have to consider whether the follower is aligned with, respectful of, supports the leader and the leader's vision and mission or not. Well, the isolate is not engaged at all, so they're just neutral. They're not
Mm.
really for or against. The bystander might appear to be going along with the leader. They're slightly engaged, but they're not contributing. So now is where it gets to be important for the leader and follower to know within ourselves and our team. A participant can participate in ways that moves everything forward towards the vision of the leader, or the participant could be a naysayer or a critic and moving against. The activist, in my personal view, is the most challenging in a certain way because the activist now not only participates strongly, but gives new ideas and innovates and throws things in. Well, if that person's aligned with the leader, leader's best follower, best friend. I love this person because now they'll motivate others, they'll push others, they'll encourage, they'll be a cheerleader. But if the activist doesn't respect the leader or disagrees with the vision, they have no qualms but to oppose and to get others to oppose. Others argue that the most difficult is the extreme, the diehard, literally do or die. We'll do anything for the leader no matter what. We'll be, jump in the lake, run off the cliff, do whatever, either for them or oppose them, existential threat, etc.
Mm.
To me, although the diehard is the most challenging in terms of their extreme, the diehard is obvious. You
Mm.
know who they are based on their behavior, so you either include or exclude them. The third dimension, if you will, is whether we adapt to situations. So I know in myself, I am and have as far back as I can remember been an activist. Whether that's my personality and genetics of my personality, or it's because my parents raised me that way, I've always been whatever I'm engaged in, I throw myself into and I try to give ideas, but I also realize I've been aligned and not aligned with chairs, other leaders, deans, presidents of university, etc. So this next issue is recognizing we need to adapt, just like I talked about when to play loud or soft, when to listen and when to play, when to leave. Here we need to know perhaps, and I use an example. One of my sons, who's now 33, when he was 5 years old, he was hit by a car. Oh my God. I raced out. Fortunately, he was fine, but we didn't know at the time. My tendency would be to tell everyone what to do, which when I first said, call 911, do this, being an activist and a diehard, if you will, worked great. But as soon as the rescue squad got there, I had to back off. I had to let the pros do the work. Boy, was that hard for me to adapt and now be there and hold his hand. And my wife and I traveled with him in an ambulance. And when we got to the hospital, I had to force myself to leave the room to be a bystander or isolate so the pros could do their job. So understanding what your followers are. If you have a follower who is an activist, they really need to know and believe and that they're respected and engaged. If you have a bystander or an isolate, how do you kick them into action? And on all of them, do you monitor to encourage alignment? So we believe that working with these different types, you can really optimize the three things that are key to a team: morale, cohesiveness, and then performance.
There's Uh, I mean, morale, cohesiveness, and performance certainly are the end results here. But there's a different, to me, as I listen to this, there's different elements of nurturing, right, for each of these different roles, and so or different. Yeah, different roles. And so when you have your bystander, there's an element of nurturing there to kind of move them up the ladder, or maybe the isolate. And then as just as you, I have spent most of my life in that die hard or even activist role, right? And so it's a different element of nurturing, a different element of leading, and it adds a multi-dimensional aspect to the people you interact with in your organization. So it's very beautiful how you've laid that out,
But
Dr. Grunberg.
that's really nice, Boomer. I have to say that for the audience, it's fascinating to me, and obviously the psychologist speaking, the verb that you used. I agree with it, but it says so much of the way you think about relationships that you said nurture. I agree with that. Others might have said I needed to guide them or encourage them or motivate them or force them. But it's interesting the way, obviously you're being very revealing on how you believe good relationships are built. Nurturing certainly is a wonderful way, but depending on one's own personality and the personality of others, some people don't want to be nurtured.
Mhm.
Others need to be nurtured. So that's another um, uh, nuance here that needs to be considered.
It's a it's becoming a multifactorial. I don't want to use the problem science. It's not a multifactorial problem. It's a multifactorial opportunity, right? Is
I love it. So I would have said challenge. You're showing that you're much more younger than me, and I love the idea of there's no weaknesses. There are opportunities for growth. I'm used to that euphemism, but these are important challenges, and if our goal, which I like to think it is in most of our cases, to achieve missions that benefit others as well as ourselves, then you're absolutely right. These are wonderful opportunities for success.
Communication is just to give you some insight in our organization. When I'm involved at this point in almost all of our hiring. Uh, One of the key factors that I look for in anyone that we hire, especially because we're a remote team at this point. We get together a few times a year, but being remote, having a lot of our conversations on Zoom or on Slack or whatever technology, I've come to find that communication almost trumps everything else in terms of whether or not the person is going to be successful in the organization. Of course, there's competence and those types of things, but uh, I want to spend a moment with you on communication, in particular, communication in both leadership and followership, how they differ, and then how we can train it. Because one of those, I'm of the belief, at least to this point in my life, that most skills are trainable. Maybe not quantum physics for somebody who hates math, but you know, communication itself seems to be trainable. And in different roles, it requires probably a different method of doing it. So, can we spend a moment on communication and how we do that in both that leadership and followership situations?
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with you. I so much agree with you, which is why my colleague Chuck Callahan and I, and then my colleague Erin Barry and I have continued to pull communication out from the other competencies. Again, every leadership model mentioned you have to be a good communicator, but it is, as I've said before, the how, not just of leadership and followership, of relationship building. So, with regard to your question, a few thoughts that may be of value to the listeners. One is having us again a self-awareness of our communication style, but because communication's goal is understanding, recognizing elements of sending and who is the intended receiver. So, for example, again, I'll go back to my work in healthcare mostly. I spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to encourage and help physicians realize when you're communicating with the patient for understanding, what are you doing to confirm they're really understanding you? So it's certainly considering the avoidance of jargon that's never explained, you know, so that one is explaining with words and not a matter of making it simpler or dumbing it down, but making it understandable. Also, and this is really very clear when dealing with a patient, what's the context? That is the patient coming and fearing that they're going to be hearing some really serious illness or injury information, and because of that stress, they're not processing, whether it's about their own life or a loved one, or are they coming out of anesthesia, or go on and on and on. How many times have I watched physicians, too many times, I must say, just rattle off information and then the famous, well, do you understand? And the uh-huh, and it's over. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So first, when we're dealing with sending, thinking through and being aware, video recording or audio recording oneself and listening to it, practicing speaking in a mirror, one's facial expressions, what's called paralanguage as well as body language. Paralanguage refers to other elements that is not the content of language, but is the tempo, the rhythm, the intonation, the volume, the intensity, the speed, lots of characteristics. Then, of course, with communicating, and this is different issues for virtual communication versus in person, but body distance, background, eye gaze, etc. So, to improve as a communicator, again, what am I communicating? Do I have ways of communicating that are interfering with understanding because they're distracting or they're complex? Do I say like or or ums and ahs? What's been referred to as verbal tics. And am I aware of that? Or or various expressions. Oh, hey, you guys. And oh, you guys get me, right? You guys get me, right? You guys get me, right? These not only irritating but distracting. Can we get rid of verbal tics? Speed and tempo. I have a tendency, again, based on the culture in which I grew up and my family, to talk much too fast. Right now, I'm talking probably at a half to a quarter of the speed that I would with my family. Even though this is the speed I should use with them, my normal speed is talking to them like this. And I would rather say to my wife, well, why don't we do this? And then we'll go to the store and then we'll do it. Not that that's effective, but I have to be self aware. So sending the information, clarity, also, and we get back to the importance of frank feedback. Feedback and being honest with oneself. Did I listen to myself, watch myself, and try to improve my communication? And do I seek feedback from others I respect? But then there's the other side, improving as a listener. Here's something that, if you ask my wife, I still need a lot of work at. And that is, as a good listener, are you really attending to the information for understanding? Do you pause and allow the sender of information to complete their thought? Do you have a mutual understanding on when you will question or how you affirm understanding? And affirm, particularly if it's complex instructions, whether in a business setting, a medical setting, a sports team, it's not just, yeah, I get it. It's, let me explain in my own words what we're doing. So we all profit from becoming better communicators, and then to be both better leaders and better followers, to determine through frank feedback and other observers whether or not we're accomplishing that goal. Now, I'm curious, I don't usually do this, Boomer, but I want to ask you the question. How does that compare with your experience in business and in the various roles you play with this and other podcasts, whether dealing with guests? I mean, you're always remarkably polite and let me go on forever. I try not to. But how also dealing with colleagues and coworkers?
So it's a very one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because it's a topic I think about often, especially as you're building an organization which is really starting to hit its stride, grow rapidly, and you potentially end up in a situation where you're growing fast and pretty soon you've hit Dunbar's number and you don't know everybody in the organization, right? And so, how do you communicate as an executive, as a leader in the organization in a way that is clear to everybody across the organization? And is that possible? It's something that I focus on quite a bit. And also, one of the dynamics that you just hinted at, and one of the things we are trying to foster, at least within our organization, is an element of uh, individual contribution at any level. So, what I mean by that is it doesn't matter who you are in the organization, there's an element of personal contribution that you can make. Can you, and particularly from a leader's perspective, how do I foster that confidence in each individual as we grow to be able to feel like they can either approach me, approach somebody else in the organization with an idea, and with the confidence that they know they'll be listened to. These elements are all things that I consider on a daily, if not hourly basis, right? How do you create that? And that feeds into culture, right? Which is something that we haven't really chatted about here. But that element of followership and kind of moving people into that kind of activist role is something that I think about quite often. Not sure if I answered your question there, but it's not always common in business, and I think specific organizations have. If you think about more traditional organizations, they have a hierarchy. You report to your manager reports to their manager, etc., and you don't really go skip the ladder, so to speak. But there is an element we've seen, at least in the past couple of years, and there's a few specific organizations where they proclaim they have a flat leadership structure, but that can become trite sometimes. So it's, how do you create those elements of cultural contribution to the top from both follower and leadership side? But it's, again, this is something that I could speak to you about for hours and get your opinions on. So it's conversations that you and I will have in the future.
Yeah, I just briefly, I'll add, I think the point you raised is very interesting, very important, and it comes back to the issues of, does one have trust in a psychologically safe environment? The challenge, in my view, is while providing an opportunity and encouraging all members of the team, regardless of their level, to that their contribution is valued and listened to. The challenge, in my view, is that they do not, as a result, misunderstand where they are in that hierarchy. So that one, so part of this, in my view, is that the leadership or the communication advisor, consultant, needs to help the organization determine for that organization and to be consistent with its culture, as well as for the individuals from whom you wish to solicit input. First, what form, what are the media and the mechanisms by which the followers are comfortable providing frank feedback? Do they want to be it face to face? Do they want it through a peer leader, a designated boss leader, a hierarchical leader? Do they want to have anonymous input opportunity? A suggestion box that they want the suggestions to be visible but anonymous, or they want the suggestions to be clearly identified. That's very interesting. I've been really surprised the change over the last decades on whether students want to provide feedback to faculty in which they are identifiable or not. Very not what one would always expect. So to me, the first issue is organization determines, do they actually want input? If
Mm,
they want input, they not only need to just say it, yeah, I have an open door policy, all this nonsense they throw around.
mhm,
Just let me know anytime. Again, I've been in organizations at times when I've heard that from leaders, only to find that the people in the hierarchy with me resent it when I actually follow what I thought the designated leader wanted and went to them.
mhm.
So I think understanding the process by which the communication is provided is of paramount importance.
Mm,
To see whether or not you're really going to get the input, and then again, whether or not, if they don't want to go through the hierarchy, whether one once or twice or quarterly, once or twice a year or quarterly, there's a peer discussion in which there's a peer representative who meets with 5 or 10 or 15 people. Said, what are the three most important points? So I think organizations that truly want input, some do, some don't really, but if they really want it, you've got to make sure that the members of the organization, the followers, feel safe in providing the information. I've been in settings where, over the many years I've been in universities, where it's safe, where it's not safe. But then there's other individuals. So, for example, something I constantly point out to I'm a full professor with tenure for decades. Short of being convicted of a felony or a serious ethics violation, I'm not joking, I cannot be fired. So I've argued others who are like me, we have a grave responsibility to be the spokesperson, not for ourselves, but for those who, the staff, the assistant professors, the non-tenured faculty. So that's the other thing is, are there members of an organization who are trusted and can gather the information and get it up there? So process, culture, this is tough stuff. It'd
It
be
is.
interesting if you ever wanted to have a panel discussion with people in different settings who have succeeded and failed in this. A very important question you raised.
When we're talking about healthcare, and I mentioned to you earlier about our nonprofit and health optimization medicine in practice. What we do is we have an online learning management system which teaches doctors and practitioners how to optimize for health rather than treat disease. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is not only the leadership of how to get this into the cultural awareness, but also how these practitioners or doctors can transition from that sort of authoritative role that we talked about earlier and into a role by which we're it's more dynamic. And maybe if you don't mind giving us a few anecdotes on how leadership and followership changes when you start to involve more of a team practice in areas like medicine.
Yeah, sure. Actually, a couple of things come to mind that may be relevant to the question. One is it's a cultural perspective, which actually was developed broadly in business. Originally introduced by James Carse, the idea of what he called the infinite game approach. Simon Sinek, then, more recently, took the notion and argued that an infinite versus finite game perspective really differentiates companies that are successful. Recently, just a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I wrote a paper in which we took that same notion, built from Carse and Sinek, and applied it to healthcare, which is, I think, right on point for your question. If we use a finite model of business, it's how many widgets do you make? How much money do you make at that point? If you use an infinite game, it's how do you grow your brand, your concept, the innovation, etc. Well, this same concept, I believe, is essential in enhancing well-being in the way that you've already alluded to, and that is a finite game approach to healthcare is I treat the injury and that's it. Absolutely, much of it has to be done. I stop the bleed, I take out the appendix, I give the appropriate antibiotic, I put on the corrective lenses, on and on. It's a finite approach. The infinite game approach to healthcare says the correction of the injury, the problem, what brought was the beginning of enhancing health. So, therefore, the healthcare professional should not only stop the bleed, they should investigate what was the cause and then educate. Was it because of sloppiness or dangerous behavior, or there were things that the person tripped over in their home? Thinking in terms of prevention, but optimizing wellness, physical, psychological, spiritual, as if you get that broad, health. So the first issue is with regard to the organization you asked about, and my compliments for focusing on that is, do they have an infinite healthcare mindset or a finite healthcare mindset? That should be discussed. It's like, huh? Well, when I'm done seeing the patient today, am I done with the patient? That's the finite. Or have I formed a relationship so then someone, whether it's even a robocall, but is there a follow up or information? Or let's already make your next appointment to check in, but the appointment can be virtual to see how you're doing. That's important. The other place, if you will, you asked for an anecdote. Um, Again, my colleague Aaron Barry, who I write most of my leadership things with, has really focused in a very important arena, and that's the operating room. How should an operating room, a surgical operating room, be organized in terms of leadership? Traditionally, the physician, most senior physician surgeon, is in charge in an authoritarian fashion. Bang. The other less experienced physicians and surgeons assist that person, as do the various surgical nurses, the anesthesiologists, others, etc. Well, we argue that's not the way the operating room should work. It should be shared leadership. Huh? Not servant leadership where the patient's in charge, but shared. We originally got information about the condition and a full understanding. But when the patient first comes in, everyone should understand who's in charge. The anesthesiologist. The anesthesiologist, either physician or what's called the CRNA, the certified registered nurse anesthetist, is in charge. Whoever is most closely monitoring the patient. Now, whether the patient has other life-threatening situations, and besides the anesthesiologist, there is another person monitoring their vitals, that's the person who's in charge. And that leadership must be understood and respected by the surgeons and the other physicians, nurses in the room. Only when the person monitoring vital signs and and the anesthesiologist says, okay, ready to go, now they turn over the leadership to the surgical staff. The surgical staff, similarly, though, although that subgroup is now in charge, should be shared, whether it's the head nurse, the scrub nurse, but an understanding that it's not the old um, stereotype of the screaming loud middle-aged or older male surgeon who's literally throwing instruments around and screaming or telling jokes or doing whatever they want, or even the image we got in the old TV show MASH, where Hawkeye Pierce, although this brilliantly skilled and knowledgeable surgeon was just, whether he wanted to tell jokes or be ridiculous, he was clearly in charge and everyone else was his underling. The focus of a good operating room is the well-being of the patient. So the leadership needs to be shared. Now, I'll use another situation from other colleagues. One of my colleagues who's made a really good point to me is a critical care physician. He makes a really interesting point. Someone comes into the emergency room. Who's in charge? Well, first, we haven't even gotten to the physician or nurse or others who will take care. Maybe it's a rescue squad that's bringing him in. They're in charge. Now, someone who's making a decision on how to prioritize this individual, whether they're going to wait an hour, 3 hours, 10 minutes, or 10 seconds, that leadership must be respected and understood. Back to your point, Boomer, about excellent communication, but shared leadership. Then when the individual gets to the emergency team, emergency medicine doc, they're in charge again with the appropriate nurses, staff, support staff. Not done. They determine when to turn that individual over to critical care team. Now they're in charge. Critical care team wants to and should gather all information about that patient, what was happening, background. Do they have history? Did they get records? What do they know? Is there a significant other in the waiting room? Is there something, they have the time. And now this is a very important, challenging part. As the critical care team determines when is the person stable enough to now go to which ward, whether it's for the cardiology, oncology, nephrology, rheumatology, on and on and on. So that's a shared leadership understanding, appreciation. We all work together. Another example from medicine, people may go back, an interesting example from the old TV show House. House clearly was presented as a truly brilliant internist and broader physician for doing what's called differential diagnosis. Extraordinarily complex, almost mysterious cases. House's brilliance allowed this very small subset of physicians have that style, that interest, that type of intellect. Remarkably important. But we also saw on that TV show House's own problems with dealing with others and staff, as well as his own conflicts with his own life. Good example would have been, again, now we'll take these examples. I would have loved to have been able to be a mentor to Hawkeye Pierce in order to discuss with him what was he doing that was engaging and helping the team, and where did he need to take it down a notch. Now, as that show changed from different actors, Colonel Potter, the actor who took, actually was much closer to a realistic, outstanding military medical commander. He knew when to let Hawkeye go off and be ridiculous, and he also knew when to basically tell him to shut up or shut down. You know, but that but the relationships, the difficulty that we had, Pierce in MASH did not optimize relationship with all the other physicians when they had Major Burns and others who was still a physician. The hatred, the competitiveness, very unhealthy, not optimal for the patients. If we move to House as the other example, again, House could have used a psychologist, medical psychologist, communication scientist as his colleague to say, look, your brilliance is amazing, but you also should be helping and mentoring and encouraging and getting more input from everyone rather than everyone's afraid you're going to just think they're an idiot. So clearly, people have different knowledge, different abilities, different roles, different responsibilities. But I don't know. As I'm listening to you, I can't help but there's a song that's going through my head, and that's Aretha Franklin singing "Respect."
Yeah.
It's like RESPECT. If respect doesn't mean that everyone's an equal or it's all a democracy, but is respect is absolutely vital to human relations.
So there's a lot of in those anecdotes. There's a lot of key points that you mentioned from today's conversation, and um, it sounds like particularly in an emergency room or potentially battlefield that, or at least the common thread that I hear is communication is key. But in different contexts, one would assume that leadership or followership role and that dynamic requires clear communication and knowing, particularly in those high pressure situations, who is the leader and who is the follower at any given time. And one of the things that you alluded to with House that has come up again in conversation is frank feedback, and just being able to take on that frank feedback and allow it to or help it shape you as both in your leadership and followership roles. So these anecdotes have actually helped summarize this today's conversation in a beautiful way. And for all the practitioners listening here, that context of and being able to relate to those situations hopefully solidifies a lot of what we've talked about here today. Dr. Grunberg, I have one final question for you. And this is a fun question that I've come to enjoy in closing out this podcast. So today's podcast or the show is called Smarter, Not Harder. And one of the questions that we like to ask everybody is, what is your one piece of advice for somebody listening here today, practitioner or non-practitioner, so that they can live smarter, not harder?
Slow down in every way. And it's something that's hard. Slow down when you're walking your dog to appreciate nature and others the way your dog does or a child does. Slow down to listen to others. Um, Time is precious and time is fleeting, but slow down.
Thank you. There's something in there that maybe this is another conversation about leadership and presence, and the role of presence in leadership, but also followership. I know it comes out in various elements of what we talked about today, but one of the areas that I focused on a lot in my life because I was so bad at it before is presence. And one of those, I guess, messages that the universe keeps stamping into my forehead is slow down. So, Dr. Grunberg, this has been an absolute pleasure. If people wanted to find you, your work, where should they head?
The easiest is to Google my name, Neil, Neil, Grunberg, Grunberg. And one can find many of my hundreds of papers I've published or other podcasts I've done either on leadership or addiction, um, or they can always email me if they have a question, neil.grunberg at usuhs.edu. And it's always my pleasure. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to you and to share some ideas and thoughts with your audience.
I know we had a bit of a technical difficulty a few minutes ago, but Dr. Grunberg, I'm always elated every time I get to talk to you, whether it was our previous conversation on your work in addiction or today. You illuminate so much when it comes to areas that I want to focus on and learn more about. So I have a list of material I need to review and follow up on. And perhaps, once I've done that, we'll get together for a round two, hopefully in person, because it's been far too long. But thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much.
To all those listening out there, have a wonderful day.